All right, so first things first, we're going to start off with the Hello World connector, just so you can get familiar with the SDK environment. And then we'll start building up the unsecured and secured API calls from there. So first of all, when you're building a connector, what you need is a working directory. So this directory will basically have all your logo files for your connector and the code as well and all that other stuff. So your working directory can be in your desktop, it can be in your documents or any other folder that you typically work in. So I'm going to start off by creating a folder in the desktop. So I'm going to go new folder. And the folder name that I want to use is connector tutorial. And this folder will essentially have all my connector files that I'm going to use to build my connector. So once you have this directory created, open up Visual Studio Code. So you want to navigate to your working directory first. So you go File, Open Folder, and you want to go to the directory you just created, so Desktop, and Connector Tutorial. So you want to go Connector Tutorial and just hit Select Folder. All right, so now what you want to do is you want to go down to the Power Query SDK and hit Create an Extension Project. If you don't see this Power Query SDK, you probably don't have the extension enabled. So you just want to go back to the prerequisites and make sure you enable Power Query SDK. So hit create an extension project. So right now on the bottom center top is telling me to type in a project name. I'll call this connector test, and don't worry, we can change this later on the code if we want to. But for now, this template that we're going to use, we're just going to call it connector test. All right, so it created all these files in my working directory, all these PNG files, this PQ file over here. If I go back to my desktop and I go to connector tutorial, you can sort of see how it created this new folder here and all these files and this bin folder as well. So let's walk through what's happening here. For every connector, you start off with a section and the section name. So in this case, it's connector test. This function here is saying that it's going to use data source kind connector test, which is basically this function over here. It's basically implying that your authentication is anonymous, as the username, password, windows, and so on are all commented out. So you're using anonymous as your authentication source, which is typical for most APIs. And then this connector test.publish is basically saying, referencing this function over here. And this function is basically saying this connector is in beta mode. So when you pick this connector off your get data, your connector will say beta. What the name of your connector is. So it's the button title, which is connector test. And then you can change this to whatever the name of your connector is. What your source image is. So your source image is connector test.icons, which is essentially this function over here, saying that it's using this PNG file to represent the icon of your connector. So if I go back to my working directory, this connector test 16, this is basically the icon that I'm going to use to represent my connector. So you can sort of use your own icon to show what your connector may look like in the get data dialog box. So we talked about all the different sections of the Power Query SDK, except for this let function here. And this let function is essentially the mQuery portion of what's happening with the connector. So if you were to write mQuery, this is what you would be writing. This is a little bit complex, so I'll just make this a little bit more simpler. Get rid of the first line. Let's call this message here, hello world. And I'm going to get rid of this optional message as text. So what's happening here is, first of all, I'm declaring this function here, connector test.contents, and I'm not passing any parameters through here. And we'll talk about what happens when you do pass in parameters. So we're not passing any parameters. And the first step of the query is declaring this step called A, which just says hello world. And we are just going to display that message. So very simple and straightforward. So once you have this set up, what you want to do is you want to build the connector. So when I say build the connector, you're essentially going to take all this code file and then these PNG files, and you're going to compile them all into one single binary file, which is the mes file. And that mes file is essentially the connector that you created. So let's take a look at how that works. So you want to hit Control, Shift, and B. And then in the center top, you see it says build connector project using make PQX, which is the default option. So just hit enter on that. So didn't mention any errors, so everything is looking good. So we are done building this mes file. So if you go here to your working directory, you go to connector test, bin, any CPU, debug. So this mes file was just created. So it says here 9:37 p.m. It says 9:38 p.m. So yeah, it was just this is the file that was just created when I hit build. So now let's test it here. First, what you want to do is you want to hit set credential, and I'll explain to you why we're doing that in a bit. So hit set credential. So it's asking, do you want to set credential for connector test? That's what you want to do, hit enter. Do you want to do it for connector test.query.pq? I'll explain to you in a bit what that means, hit enter. Do you want it to be anonymous? Yes, hit enter. All right, so the credential was set. And now if you hit evaluate current file, and we can see this hello world working. So what's going on here? Um, Basically, you have this connector test.query.pq. And if you go here, let me just open this on the main window. So this is essentially what you will be seeing in your Power BI environment. So if you go to advanced editor, you're going to see something like this, where it says let result equals connector test.contents. And this connector test.contents is basically saying that connector test.contents is equal to this Power Query step that will happen in the background. So you'll not actually see this in Power Query, rather you'll be seeing just this piece of text. And I'll talk about why we needed to set credential. So if you go down to the mes file that you just built, you want to copy this, and then you want to go to the directory where your Power BI custom connectors are. So this would be in Documents, Power BI Desktop, Custom Connectors, and you want to paste your custom connector here. Now you want to open up Power BI. So now that I have my Power BI opened, I can just create new report. And from Get Data, I should be able to see the connector that I just built. So if I search connector test, so this is my connector test. And you can see it's sort of like that PNG file we looked at earlier. That's the icon that's being used here. So double click on that, continue. So we are now setting the credential on Power BI Desktop. So this is the same step that we did in Visual Studio Code where we were setting the authentication to be anonymous. So you want to set it to anonymous and hit connect. And finally, you can see this hello world message that came in. Again, if I go to advanced editor, I can sort of see that same function being called on my query file that we were looking at in Visual Studio Code. So that's sort of going full circle in understanding how this connector works. So now that we got this out of the way, we can start working on our unsecured API calls.